So welcome everyone to our workshop on CVs and resumes. CVs and resumes, as many of you probably know at this point, play important roles in the fellowships and awards application process. Of course, they play very important roles in the jobs application process as well. But since we're the Office of Graduate Fellowships and Awards, we're more concerned about that first role that they have. In that process for fellowships and awards CVs, they give reviewers a quick breakdown of your education, your work experience, your professional accomplishments, but often you're asked to only provide a 1 or 2 page version of your resume or CV, which of course requires you to edit it down and to think about what you're discarding, what you're keeping, and how you're focusing it for that particular opportunity. So fortunately, at Florida State University, we have an excellent career center with wonderful and talented staff, and they can help you prepare CVs and resumes for fellowship and award applications, as well as for job applications. We'd highly recommend you use that resource. And we're very happy today to be joined by a guest facilitator from the Career Center. So it's my honor to introduce Assistant Director of the Career Center and the Career Liaison for graduate and pre-graduate students, Megan Crowe, who will be presenting today's workshop.
Well, hello, everyone. It is great to connect with you all. For those thinking it's not too cold, I'm one of those people who think that this is way too cold for Florida in March, but we will make it through. So I'm excited to talk to you all today about really developing your resume or kind of a condensed CV for fellowships and awards. We're going to talk through about some of the strategies, but one thing that I love out of these workshops is for you to walk away with what you need. So whether you have a copy of your resume or CV up in front of you, or you're jotting down notes, feel free to jump into the chat with any questions, to unmute as we go. We're going to kind of go over some big picture items and then section by section. So that way you can kind of check in with the community of like, hey, this is how I'm doing it on my document. Is this a good idea? So just know that we want this to be as interactive as you all want it to be. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So like Keith said, my name is Megan Crowe. I'm joining from the Career Center, where I'm one of our assistant directors for career advising, counseling, and instruction. I hold virtual and in-person appointments, though I know a lot of grad students like to Zoom in, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays from noon to 3. You can always sign up for those through Knoll Network. However, I also know that you are balancing very full schedules, so you can also shoot me an email. And at the end of today's presentation, I'll share my contact information with you. If you're ever wanting to have a discussion about your resume or your CV, or how you're able to kind of market your professional brand through different application materials. So just know as we hit on different things today, like he said, we've got great staff over here who are here to help and support you. You do not have to go through this process alone. So one thing that we want to think about anytime we are building marketing materials, whether we're applying for a very specific grant or a fellowship or an award that you found, is thinking about what you have to market. So in the Career Center, we've highlighted these big buckets, so to speak, that a lot of your skill sets and abilities, regardless of what you're doing, may fall into, right? So a lot of you are involved in research, right? What do your research and innovation skill sets look like? What are some specific projects you've done, publications you've had, presentations you've given, or even just professional development activities that you've engaged with? Maybe you're applying to something that's very heavily focused on leadership, right? How have you developed as a leader? What does your leadership style look like? So I want you to think about, and we'll pause here just for a moment, think about what are some of the skill sets that you are most proud of, right? And this might shift in different conversations for different things. But for example, if you're applying for a leadership award, what would you want somebody in that award committee to know about your leadership skills, right? So these are some of the things that you want to think about as you're developing your more extended CVs, but also thinking about when we get to that conversation about tailoring down, what are the most important areas, right? We'd love in an ideal world to give them everything we've ever done and so all of our qualifications. But like Keith was saying earlier, sometimes we've really got to focus down and give them the main points. So this is just a little visual here for you to start thinking about some of those areas. So as you're reflecting on different skill sets that you have, different qualities that you are going to bring to the different spaces you arrive in, You want to start this process of thinking about your resume and CV by really becoming the expert on yourself, right? Who better to tell your story, to market your capabilities than the person who's lived those experiences? So you want to think about, and I find it really challenging when we say like, be unique, stand out in the application process, right? Because what does that mean? That's different for all of us. So this doesn't mean that you've had to have completed something so groundbreaking, so notable that you're the only person in the world to have done it. That's not really what we mean when we say be unique, right? What I like as a better word is be authentic, right? Think about what's really driving you. You all are doing a lot as graduate students here at FSU. I'm always amazed as I hear about the different research and assistantships and roles that you are all taking on. Tell that story, but think about how that has built the skill sets that you have. It has condensed your different interest areas or topics that you're very passionate about, and also how that's aligning with some of the values that you hold. The more you have a good understanding of these different areas, the easier it's going to be for you to pitch yourself through documents like a resume or through a CV. So now we're going to get into some of the specifics, right? So again, when you are applying to different fellowships and awards, the first thing that you want to do is follow instructions, right? So if they're asking for a 1 to 2 page resume, you are not overachieving by giving them your 5-page CV, right? So you want to make sure that you're following those directions. But I do want to point out some similarities between resumes and CVs, right? So both of these documents are serving as a way for you to communicate your professional qualifications, right? What do your skills and experiences look like? They're also both a marketing tool, and specifically, oftentimes this is your first impression, whether it's with an employer, an organization, an awards committee. This is the first document that they're reading to gain some insights about who you are, what you've done, and what you can bring to their space. So we want to make sure we make a good first impression. Again, talked a lot about skills and abilities. This is your opportunity to really expand on those pieces and also showcase the different experiences that you have been able to engage with. So the ultimate goal of a resume or CV is not to get you the job or get you to the award, right? It's to move you forward in that process. So oftentimes there's different rounds to these pieces, or you're going to need to submit personal statements or other application materials. So we like to think of a resume or CV almost like the movie trailer, right? There needs to be enough in there that we want to go see the full movie, right? So there needs to be enough of a connection between who you're presenting and what skills you're highlighting and experiences on this document and the nature of what you're applying for. Some of the differences between these two documents, again, you always want to follow directions, so know what they're asking of you. But for a CV, typically there's not going to be a page limit, right? This doesn't mean fill this up with fluff and more pages is better. We still want to focus on quality and have it be well written. It's going to focus a lot more on skill sets around instructing, researching, being a scholar. Heavy focuses are for academic positions you may be applying for, research roles, and some kind of government positions as well. And again, some of the core areas being things like teaching, research, and service. Now, a resume generally has a 1 to 2 page limit. Again, you're going to hear me say this several times. If they say 1 page, they really mean 1 page. I get that a lot. So it is kind of up to you to start making some judgment calls, right? What is the most important content that they need to see in the space that you have been given? So that's where we come to reflecting on some of the skills in specific areas, really based on what you're applying to, right? If you're applying to an award that's really focused in on service, we're probably going to want to focus in on a lot more of your volunteer experiences and mentorships and service to the university and community, as opposed to really detailing out maybe some of the research roles that you've held. So it is thinking about, some of the focus of that document, and really can be used for a lot of different type of applications. So if you're kind of looking in front of you and you have maybe a version of your CV, maybe you have a version of your resume, what I recommend doing is giving yourself what I call a running document, So this might be more like a CV, it may be an extended resume. But in that running document, keep everything you've ever done, right? You are doing a lot of great work. It is much easier to remember that in the moment than at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, when you try to think back. My brain is fried from all this writing and lit reviews and things that I'm doing. What did I accomplish, right? So keep that running list somewhere. So that way, as you're building these tailored resumes, you're not starting with a blank document, but you're kind of saying, oh, that leadership position was great, or oh, that invited guest speaker role that I had would be important to highlight. So you're kind of just weaving in those different experiences as they pertain to the specific award or fellowship or grant that you may be applying to. So as you get prepared, you've got that running document, maybe it's your CV again in front of you, and you're looking at an award description, you're thinking, how do I get started? Well, you want to start by thinking about who is going to be reading this resume. Who is my target audience, and what do I really want to tell them? So I encourage some students to talk out loud. If you're like me, I love talking, I love speaking to people. So sometimes it's easier for me to talk through like, okay, if I was in an interview, what experiences would I make sure that I brought up in that interview, right? Or I have other grad students who kind of really tease apart the position description and say, you know, okay, in the award description, they mentioned leadership 5 times. Where do my leadership experiences come in? Or how can I make this parallel or this connection to what the awards committee may be looking for? So again, really think with that tailored resume approach, you're not telling them everything, right? You can't, you don't have the space. So instead, you're asking yourself and making that judgment call of what do I feel like is most important, right? Thinking about what are your strongest selling points? What are you most proud of, right? I go back to that, what do you want them to ask you about in an interview? You know, really getting to highlight, here's what makes me a great candidate for this award. Here's what I feel like, you know, I meet the criteria for this description. Then you want to think about, right? Sometimes we have to be brief. I could go on for 8 bullet points about my graduate assistantship in this role that I have. Can you give them the 4 most important, right? So even within some of these experiences, you do have to think that every line on your resume is valuable real estate. Is what you're sharing worth the line that it's taking up? And it gets difficult. Again, that's why we're here. We're happy to be that sounding board to kind of go through with you to kind of ask some of those questions. So that way you feel really proud of that 1 to 2 page document that you're building, that it tells enough of your story, right? That it shares enough of your qualifications. The last thing that you want to look at is the language of your target field, right? If you're applying to an award that's maybe related to your dissertation and it's going to be read by people who are not specialists in your field, you need to think about that, right? If I'm reading a resume and it's really jargon heavy and I'm having a hard time understanding it, I'm not going to be able to see your qualifications shine through as directly. So think also about, you know, when you think about that audience, is this a specialized audience? Is this a more generalized audience? To think about how you can best translate and communicate some of those skills and experiences too. I'm going to pause here real quick, make sure I get my chat open. For those of you who've been popping in, please feel free to use that chat with any questions that come up as we're moving through these different areas. But any thoughts or questions around really thinking about this process before you start building the document, kind of thinking about who your audience may be? And it's absolutely okay if you're more in the processing realm as well. Yeah, Henri, go ahead.
So when you said that it's a maximum of 4 bullet points for the 2-page documents, is it for every job? Like it shouldn't be more than 4 bullet points?
That's a great question. So the answer is going to be it depends, right? So you may have space, maybe you have just 2 or 3 experiences that you really want to expand on, and those may have more than 4 bullet points, right? But maybe you have 5 experiences you want to talk about, and you do not have space to give all 5 of those 8 bullet points. So it's kind of asking your question about what are the main points about this experience that I want to communicate to my audience, and how can you do that most effectively, right? Sometimes we also get in our heads and we get really wordy, and it's like, can I simplify this, right? Can I take this 3-line bullet point or this 3-sentence paragraph and condense it to something that might be a little bit more digestible, and take up less space too?
And what about when you have 5 experiences, but 3 are very similar? It's just at different places, but you were doing the same thing basically.
That is a great question. So one thing I'm always going to say, you'll hear me say at any appointment I have, is it depends, right? So I'm always going to want to compare it back to what are you applying to? But a challenge that I do see is when people use the same skill sets and the same, kind of type of experience, right? So I don't need to read 3 bullet points that tells me you led a class of 20 undergraduate students. I got that the first time. So for that next experience, tell me something different. Tell me about your grading structure, or tell me about how you built community in that classroom. So you can have roles where you're doing very similar things, but you probably did more than just 3 things in those roles. So try to talk about them in different lenses, so I don't feel like I've already read this. We want to know different things and different skills and experiences from you.
Thanks.
Great question. Yeah. I'll go to the next person. Yep, go ahead with your hand raised, and then I'll go to the chat.
Thank you. This is Daljeet, Megan, and my question is, yes, I do bring experience because I'm bridging from a different field, from teaching to IT. Now, there is a small gap in between, which I was researching for which college, which university I'm joining for my master's degree for information technology.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge I have is I'm PhD with visual arts, but now recently I've taken off my PhD from my resume because maybe it's intimidating or maybe it's not related. But I think the skills are related between visuals and information technology. So that's number 1 challenge. Second, how to bring experience from each semester, like how to put those projects in. Like, I'm not too sure about that because I haven't done that.
Yeah, so that was a great question. If you don't mind, I'm going to table it for a little bit later in the presentation when we go through the different categories.
Okay.
And that's where we'll actually share some examples of what that can look like.
Sounds good.
And learning from your community as well. So as we go through and as we get to some of those example sharings, if those of you on the call feel really great about sections of your CV or resume and want to share that as an example as well, I highly encourage that. I'm going to jump to the chat real quick. We have a question, when having lots of experience, how do you trim down for jobs? Is there a different type of resume than company experience orientation? So whether you're using your resume to apply to an award, a job, a grant, you again want to think about what is most important. So I go back to that kind of movie trailer analogy. We can't give them everything, but how do you give them enough about what they're looking for that they want to talk with you further about it, right? That they either want to read the additional statements you've provided, they want to bring you in for an interview if that's part of their process. So the resume is meant to be that stepping stone. So what we want to do is really go through that award description or position description and start to see what is the language that they're using, what are their criteria, what are they looking for, and how do you know that you meet that, right? So one thing we'll do here, as an example, this is one of the awards offered through the graduate school. The registration's currently closed, but this is kind of the award description that they make available, right? So they're looking for characteristics of leadership and level of leadership involvement. So if we were tailoring a resume for this specific award, one thing I'm looking for right away is, do you have a leadership experience section, right? Or how do you infuse the words lead, manage, coordinate throughout that document, right? So, or collaborate. So what I'm doing is, let me see if I can get my highlighter here. We'll do our little spotlight, right? Looking at some of these action verbs that pop up, right? So collaborate, manage, transition, inspire, empower, activities, just like you would kind of look at different documents for some of these key topics, you want to then think about, okay, this is what they're looking for out of my resume, right? So how can I show them these skills and show them these skills early on, right? So you may build a resume and you're like, okay, I'm going to lead with, my research and publication because, that's part of the involvement. Then I'm going to talk about these leadership skills. So, specifically an employer is not going to spend more than 15 to 20 seconds looking at your resume the first time. That is a very quick read, right? What they're doing is they're very quickly looking for some of this language that shows them, one, you read their position description, two, you understand what they're looking for, and three, you've thought about critically how you meet those different criteria or standards. So thinking about as you are coming across different descriptions, how are you thinking about showing them these specific skill sets or topic areas in your document, right? So that's why when we have that running resume, you may copy over, maybe you have a UROP mentee. So you copy over that experience and you switch your language a little bit, right? You say, manage the research coordination of this project, supervising, blah, 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 blah. But you start to use clear language and target areas to show them again that you're invested in this process and you know why you are qualified. Now, part of that too is taking confidence in yourself. I have graduate students that I work with all the time who are like, oh, I don't meet that perfectly, or I've kind of done this, but are they going to count that? So it's also up to you to market yourself, right? You've got to take that ownership of I'm doing a lot and I'm doing a lot of great work. What you're doing is you're just translating it in a way that the audience who's reading your resume sees that connection between, hey, we're looking for a student leader. They're not challenging you to say, are you a student leader, right? They're challenging you to say, show me how you're a leader. Show it to me, demonstrate it to me. So it's less of a, hey, I need to prove this, and more just, I need to show my story. I need to show, what this looks like to them. So I think I saw somebody unmute. Did somebody have a question or a thought or a comment they wanted to share? See a lot of screens, so I'm doing my best to keep on track of that. All right, well, feel free to pop it into the chat if it comes back up. But this is something that you are always welcome to do if you meet with me or any of other career liaisons. You can bring in a position description, an award description, say, here's what I'm applying for, and here's the document I was going to use. And we can kind of look at them together to say, well, how is the language matching up? How are you show them that you're really meeting these criteria that they've set in front of you? All right. So as I mentioned before, specifically in kind of what we hear from our employers is at first look, they're giving it 15 to 20 seconds. That is not a lot of time. So if your resume is really disorganized, it's not clear, the font is super tiny, it's going to be hard for them to see enough that wants them to take a deeper look. If they want to dive in more, spend more time. So first glance, when we're talking about resumes, before we even get into the content, we want to make sure that it's readable. So you want to think about, and we've got a visual example for you here. That does not mean that every resume has to look like this. I always like to add that clarifier too. But you just want something that's streamlined, right? So information that's most relevant should be at the top, right? A lot of that times that's going to be your education section first. A lot of times that's in the criteria that you be a graduate level student or at a certain stage in your program. Then you want to think about the other sections that you have. So for example, if we were using this resume on the slide for that leadership award, I'd probably actually move that leadership experience section up higher to show that point a little bit sooner. You can also see in the example that using bold and italics kind of calls your eye's attention to different places. So when you're using bold and italics and underlining, one, be consistent. So if you want to bold every position description, that's great, but don't also bold every company, every date, every location. If you put everything in bold, that kind of takes away from the power of bold, right? You can also use things like all caps. So the big thing is be consistent and think about how easy it is to read. Generally, for resumes, we want to see things in reverse chronological order. And a lot of times that makes sense because what you've been doing most recently is more targeted to what you're applying for. But sometimes when you find certain awards, you're like, okay, well, I've been doing a lot of teaching lately, but really this award is research focused. That's where having some of those different categories to say, hey, let me move my research experience section up. But within that section, you want to list it in reverse chronological order. So whatever's most recent at the top down to least recent. For in terms of sizing, right? You don't want to go smaller than 1/2-inch margins. In Microsoft Word, that's kind of their narrow setting. And then typically really no smaller than 10-point font. If you can, I would try to stick to 11. There's different, I always tell people we get into really formatting things. If you just need one extra line on your resume, there's tips and tricks we can go in there and kind of manipulate some of those things. But just as a general standard, about 1/2-inch margins and 11-point font. And you also want to think about your font type. So I have a lot of grad students who come in and they're like, oh, I heard if I use this font, it'll stand out or it'll look different. We're not really looking for your resumes to visually stand out, right? The work you've done is what's going to make you stand out. So using a font that is more recognizable, again, is easier to read quickly. Think about how many documents we read that are in Times New Roman font. You all as grad students do a lot of reading. You've learned how to read things quickly. That's how people who are reviewing resumes feel as well, right? So if it's a font they're more used to, they're able to process more of that information quickly too. So as you're looking at your documents in front of you, kind of ask yourself, how easy is this to read quickly? And are the main things that you want standing out from the page doing that effectively? Any questions on formatting? General formatting, I should say. All right, and we do at the Career Center have a resume guide that I can share at the end that has a few different visual samples in there as well. If you're like, what could this look like? And did somebody have a question? I might have jumped in over you. All right, we'll keep going. So outside of formatting, the next thing you want to think about are what are the sections or categories that should show up on my resume, right? And this is another one where I'm going to say it depends, right? It's going to depend on the nature of what you're applying for. Now, some categories that we're typically always going to see are going to be an identification section. We need to know who you are, your education section, and some kind of experience. Beyond that, you might have what I call specific experience section. So maybe you want to call attention to research experience, teaching experience, leadership experience. But there's other categories like publication, service, talking about those projects that somebody mentioned earlier. Any area where you felt you have done something that's added value for you, we want to find a space on that resume, right? So project section is a really good example of, hey, I was in this really, intensive capstone course and I had to build a whole website, or I had to do, a 14 article lit review. There's a lot of skill sets you built and developed doing that project. So while it wasn't a job that you held or a leadership position or a volunteer thing, it was still an experience you had that added value. So a lot of times when I'm meeting with graduate students, we're just having that conversation of tell me what the experience is, and we can brainstorm together where does that make sense to fit into the kind of narrative that your resume is saying, right? The other thing you want to think about, especially for fellowships and awards, right, is highlighting other awards and honors you've received, right? Show them that you've been invested in before and, what you've done with some of those pieces. So the last thing that I'll say about these typical categories is sometimes, especially if you're looking at resume templates online, which always be cautious with templates. I've seen students come before me with visually beautiful resumes that they've got off Canva or Microsoft Word sometimes that are just not functional. But one thing you'll often see on these templates is a professional summary or objective statement or executive summary that they want you to build. So that is an absolutely optional section for somebody like in the chat who has a wealth of work experience already. That summary can be helpful to summarize the main points, right? 15 years of experience working in higher education settings with, passion for supporting student development and career exploration, right? A kind of summary helps the audience to look at your resume with almost a thesis statement of what they're gleaning from it. Now, sometimes I read these summaries and they sound like fluff, right? It sounds like you're just trying to string together enough words to get a point across. So they don't always add value, but they can add value. So it's just something to ask yourself, again, just like with any section of your resume, is this adding value? Is this communicating to my audience part of my main point or my main message in me wanting, to qualify for this award or this position, whatever it may be? So we're going to go through some of these sections. So as you look at your document again in front of you, or as you're thinking about future documents, you want to start with who you are, right? We want your name there. Oftentimes you'll see kind of this format: street address, city, state, zip code, phone number, email address, right? Increasingly, right, we're putting these resumes in very public spaces. A lot of people will upload them to LinkedIn. You're sharing them widely at conferences. So you do not need to provide the entire world with your very specific street address. That is one thing I'm a big advocate for. City and state is enough, right? They don't need to know that you live on Tennessee Street. They know that you're here in Tallahassee. Some people advocate for including a zip code. Others would rather, leave that off as well. So those are kind of optional choices for you to include. Now, one thing that we do like to focus on is 2 points of contact. So that's where your phone number and email address comes in, right? Because typically, how are these committees reaching out to you? Well, they're no longer mailing you anything, right? They're probably going to pick up the phone and call you, or they're going to send you an email. So you want to make sure that any contact information you are giving, you have good access to, it's reliable. If you're listing your phone number, you have a professional voicemail inbox. Your voicemail inbox is open and not full. So that way, as these committees want to engage with you, they are able to communicate. So I put some samples up here on the slide of just different headings that you can look at. So kind of want to ask you all, what do you like about some of these and what do you not like about some of these? What are your thoughts?
May I please?
Yeah.
I was not too sure about the address anymore because there've been many myths, when I'm talking to other graduates from other universities and stuff. Some says that you need to put city or something, some says no. So I'm still confused, though. The examples I see, they look pretty good. But definitely my question is whether our LinkedIn profile and phone number is enough, or we should specify everything, like including like city, maybe just city. Like I don't mind putting it, but as things are happening around us, so much not only cybersecurity, but other security too.
Yeah.
So minimum. So I actually want to know more from you for this one. So which will be the best practice? Just the city, phone number, and the LinkedIn or email, or still we should put a little bit more?
Yeah. So some of it does come down to be a personal call, right? What you personally feel comfortable with. What I would say is a bare minimum of what I'm going to look for is, do I have 2 forms of contact to reach out to you? And do I have a general idea of where you're coming from, right? Some employers aren't going to care. Some, awards committees really, you can do this from anywhere. But generally just city and state is helpful information. And that's a little bit more on the employment side, right? Because are you relocating for this position, right? If you are, well, then it doesn't matter where you're coming from, right? But if you are here in Tallahassee, then I know I can bring you in for an in-person interview. So
Gotcha.
I would say of some of those examples I see in the chat, a lot of people are liking Jane Doe seems really clean, easy to read. Some of the other ones are harder to read. some differing thoughts on whether the font type for Anita, some say it's a little hard to read, others say it's a little bit more eye-catching or it pops. So yeah, again, these are all different ways that you can do things. Some of this comes down to personal preference, right? You might sit down with one employer and they're going to want it to look like Jane Doe, and then you sit down with another and they really like Justin's, right? So some of that is, this is not going to make or break your CV or resume. No one's going to look at this section and be like, oh, nope, this is out. Their name looks terrible, right? But we just want to make sure that they can get a lot of that main contact information that they need, right? So the main thing that I like in all of these is that the name is in bold. The name really stands out because what is the purpose of this document is to, showcase who you are. In terms of choosing to share something like a LinkedIn, we also have a lot of grad students who build portfolios. So if any of you have done like a grad world video, you might want to highlight that on a portfolio or a personal website that you have. Those are all great links that you can add because, with a one-page resume, you can't fit everything. But if they go to your LinkedIn or they go to your professional website, guess what? There's no page limit to that. So you can be giving them a little bit more information. I want to scan through the chat really quickly to make sure I didn't lose any thoughts. Yeah. So again, what my recommendation is, if you are going to share this widely on LinkedIn or a public space where you don't know who's going to be able to see it at all times, I would recommend not giving your specific address, right? If you are working personally and submitting this as part of an application and you feel comfortable doing so, that is absolutely your prerogative to do. So it's kind of your choice of what you feel comfortable sharing where, but just think about who's going to have access to that document. Now, the other reason why we like to have this conversation, because sometimes people are like, oh, well, what if I just remove everything entirely, and just give them one email address, is oftentimes we are seeing companies, and this might look a little bit different in the fellowship and awards realm, that are increasingly using AI technology to scan these documents because they may get 800 applications for one award, right? Do they have time to review all 800 applications? So they're scanning the document, looking for a lot of that key language, and depending on the system that they use, if they can't find your name easily or they can't find contact information, all that technology is trying to do is make the pile smaller. So that technology is not saying, hey, here, these are your best candidates. It's saying is, hey, these candidates were missing something. You don't need to review them, right? So we don't want that to be, oh, I left off, a phone number. Oh, I left off an email contact. So now I'm not moving forward. So just some things to think about as we're increasingly seeing changes with technology in different pieces. And that's always something that you can come meet with the Career Center to say, how readable or scannable does my resume look in terms of some of those AI pieces? Oh, that's a great question in the chat. Do you think it would be appropriate to share a link tree on a resume or CV? Talking about changes in technology, right? As some of these different types of links pop up, again, I would just ask yourself, does this share good information about me? And is it up to date, right? So I have a lot of people who are like, I have a LinkedIn, but I don't update it or should log in regularly. I'm like, well, then maybe we don't highlight that on the resume, right? So we don't want to take them to outdated or not up to date information. So as long as you're keeping things like a portfolio or a link tree, I've seen people do like their research gates and research hubs. As long as those are up to date resources, listing that in your contact information section or identification section is, definitely something you can do. All great questions. All right. So now we're going to move into the education section. So some pieces of information you want are obviously going to be your degree, any kind of concentrations. Also important to include date of degree completion, even if that's a projected, right? So they have a general idea, name of institution, location of institution, and then there's some optional pieces that you can include in education as well. Those can be like minors, GPAs, relevant courseworks, academic honors, thesis titles, advisors, and a lot of that's going to become a judgment call. I'm going to have you guys look at these two examples here, and same thing. What do we like and what do we not like? About it. So yeah, as they come in the chat, one thing you want to think about again is what is the purpose of this section, right? So to me, one thing that stands out is one, and math is not my, strong suit, but guesstimating, one is about 15 lines of text. The other is about 8, right? So is the education section something that is taking, is a worthwhile, dedication of that space, right? If something you're applying to is very focused on your background degrees, they add a lot of credibility, yeah, you might really want to expand on it. Or maybe you still want them there, but you want to condense it a little bit. I would agree with a lot of the comments in the chat that this first one over here, there's a lot of extra space, right? This is all blank space. And like I said earlier, every piece of space on your resume is real estate. Right? Is it worth a lot of this extra space that this is taking up, right? And things like, do they need to know who's all on your committee, right? Well, again, I'm going to come back to, it depends. You might be working under a nationally recognized faculty who's adding a lot of credibility to you getting this dissertation grant or some of these things that you're applying to. So it's not a yes or no, it's a, let's think about again, what is the context that this is adding? Yeah, so I like that somebody noted, hey, they made the conscious decision to bold these degrees because they really wanted that to stand out, right? Maybe you really want to emphasize the institution, then you can kind of flip-flop those. Yeah. Oh, great comment in the chat too, right? We want to avoid redundant information, right? We don't want 2 bullet points that say the same thing. If you're already having some of these faculty write you letters of recommendation or coming up in other areas of your application, is it worth the space spent here on your limited resume? Good points. Right, clear all my drawings. Right. So we will keep moving. Again, the other thing on this side is the dates are left aligned. This is something that we see a little bit more commonly on a CV, whereas on a resume, we're typically going to see the dates more on the right-hand side because they're important, but they're not the main star of what we want to highlight. So something to think about as well. All right. So now we're going to dig into experience, which is really the bulk of your resume, right? They want to know, where have you gained different skill sets and what do those experience look like? So I like to start by first expanding on what we mean by the word experience. Because a lot of times people focus in on these have to be paid positions, right? Somebody had to have hired me, selected me, and paid me to do this job for it to be valuable experience. And that is just not true. So experience can be paid or unpaid positions. They can be internships you held, volunteer or community service, leadership positions, military service, any past part-time or full-time jobs that you've held or are holding. There are a lot of different things that can fall under experience. Now, one thing that you won't see here, right, is we don't have projects listed under experience, and that's not to say that they aren't experience, right? But when we say experience, there's certain pieces of data that we're looking for, right? So I want to know, what was the role that you held? What was the name of the organization? Where was that organization located? What were the dates you held this role? And then kind of a description of what you were doing in that role in terms of the skill sets used. So this is not just list, I was responsible for this, responsible for that. We really want to see what were those skills and actions. So did you lead a class? Did you develop lesson plans? Did you, manage grading expectations? What were those specific skill sets that you used in terms of those different duties? So the best way to talk about your experiences, right? We need those kind of qualifying information to know the context, right? Let me go back. This is going to give us the context in terms of who were you working for? Where was it? These bullet point statements are going to give us more of the context of what were you doing, right? So they're more impactful when you use something called the PAR statement. And this really just stands for project, actions, and result, right? This is to make sure that we get the complete thought and not just here's the thing that I did, right? But that we get the how did you do it or why did you do it process to it. So you start by describing a project, task, or job that you had. You think specifically about what actions you took, right? What role did you play in this process? And you think about what was the result or outcome, goals, or implications of that project that you completed. So sometimes this looks a little like abstract. So let's kind of diagram it a little bit, right? So maybe your project was you were tasked with working with some of the teaching assistants within your department. And they're like, hey, we need your help with this. And you say, great, what do I need to do? And they say, hey, can you lead a 2-day training for us? And you say, yep, I can do that. So you think about, well, what was the result of you building that 2-day training? You now have a curriculum to train other TAs in your department. So you take these things together, and we're always going to lead with the action category, right? Because we want to lead with this skill set. So this becomes facilitated a 2-day training for 5 incoming teaching assistants by creating lesson plans based on department-specific learning outcomes, right? This might be a little wordy. We could probably condense it a little bit, but it gets at that idea of what was the action you were taking, what was the overall project, and what was the result, so that I, as somebody who doesn't know you, doesn't know the work that you do, am able to get an insight and almost a visual into the work that you've done. And then I should be able to relate that to my award or my fellowship or my grant criteria, right? So we also want to think about it in that tailoring process of, am I going to care that you can build training materials, or is that less relevant to what we're looking for? So this is another way to visualize it. I always tell people, if you're kind of getting stuck, think about telling me how you did something or why you did something, right? So the how is, action verb plus a specific task, plus a specific skill plus your task, right? I provided quality customer service while managing dining experiences for up to 30 students. How did you do that? By managing their dining experience, right? Or we can talk about the why you did something. You have the action, the project, and the result. You created a new order taking system, and the result was you decreased the guest wait time by an average of 2 minutes, right? One thing you'll notice about both those examples is that there's numbers in them. Part of the reason for that is to add context, right? It's helpful for us to know if you taught a 15-person class or a 500-person class. Both are valuable, but those are 2 different kinds of experiences. The other thing is that numbers stand out, right? So it helps keep our eye visually engaged in reading some of that content as well. So I would say this is kind of the most time-consuming part of building your resume, as long as you've done the work of keeping track of everything that you've done as you do it, is starting to think about what are some of the bullet points that you want to use. So another thing that I'll recommend is, as you're gaining experiences in that running resume, give yourself 15 bullet points, right? If you do 15 different things, own it, jot that down. So that way, when you're building these tailored resumes, it's saying, well, hey, I want to highlight from this teaching assistantship role my development skill sets or my organizational skill sets. What are the bullet points that help illustrate that point? So you're less having to kind of start from scratch each time, and really you're focusing more on this tailoring component of telling your story through that lens. So here is an example of some experience. It's a little bit longer, so I'm going to give you about a minute or two to scan through this. But take a look, read at some of those bullet points, and then we'll kind of discuss this. While I do that, I'm going to take a look at the chat real quick. So there's a question that says, should the majority of all your bullet points include numbers? And should you include how and why? So I typically say find a balance, right? We don't have to have everything have a quantifier, but if it makes sense and is going to add to that context, I would include it. And I would do either how or why. If you try to do both, it's going to get really long. So maybe you have 3 bullet points for an experience. So maybe you do 2 hows and 1 why, right? Or vice versa. So it's kind of just finding balance. But again, it's going to depend on what are the experiences you want to talk about and how do you want to highlight those. I'm going to stop talking for about 2 minutes and let you all read the examples here. All right, as you start having thoughts, go ahead and start popping those into the chat. Anything that stands out in a positive way, or you're kind of like, I don't really love this.
Personally, not a fan of the first one and the verbs that they use to describe. Also, information is capitalized, and I thought that it should be in the present progressive since it's still ongoing. So when they're describing those verbs, yeah.
Great thoughts. Yeah, so you'd want to look at what are the verbs that they're using and are those relevant to what they're applying for. I will say if it's a present position, we do want to use the present tense. So we would just want to say write and edit. We wouldn't want to say writing and editing. One, it just adds in a lot of extra characters. And it can stay in the present tense. So that would be the only thing there. But yeah, I think another thing from this first one is, let me get my annotate tool open again. Is I think about all this wasted space, right? If you're going to have a bullet point that goes on to the second line, you know, think about how you can use the rest of the space to really clarify that point, right? Or could we condense this down back to a 1-line resume? All right, let me go to the chat. So seeing a point of, should you focus on skills instead of experience? So like, can use this, can use that. So the examples listed here in the chat, one thing you want to avoid, right, that I like about both these examples is we get a wide variety of verbs, right? They don't say manage, 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 because all it tells me is you know how to manage, right? It doesn't tell me you can do a whole lot more outside of that. Now you bring up a good point in terms of if there are certain technical skill sets that a position is looking for, yes, you can just say that you have that skill set, but it means more to show them. I think this is a good example here. I may say, you know, I need somebody with social media experience. So you could just say use social media, but what this bullet point does is it really demonstrates to me that you have an advanced use of this resource, right? Or this skill set. So it helps me to see, you know, I can list Python on my resume. Do I even know how to launch Python? Absolutely not, right? And somebody who's reading my resume would probably gather that because I wouldn't know how to talk about it. So yes, you can infuse technical skill sets into your bullet points, but you want to back them up with a demonstration of you using that skill set because that's going to be a little bit more meaningful. Yeah, I think somebody said that this second one focuses a little bit more on like what was achieved, what was that end result. Go ahead.
Okay, Yeah, I could see that space could be utilized more um, to as real estate example you said, and also the dates should be more of right aligned. I mean that probably will give more of a visual as well as, you know, as per priorities.
Yeah.
Secondly, my question is also, maybe if you want to cover now or later, is sometimes if I'm applying to one company for different positions, different times, but I'm using their description, the keywords for AI, I feel like sometimes, oh, what if, you know, they're going to compare. So what's going to happen? Like they're different resumes. So what do you think about it? What's your opinion about it?
Yeah. So I think this is applicable even if, you know, I'm sorry, my office light likes to kick off on me. So gotta get some extra movement in. Even if you're applying, you know, you may apply like that graduate student leadership award that we had. You might apply to that several times because you didn't get it the first time. That committee's not going to expect your CV or resume to look the same. In fact, they probably don't want it to, right? They want to see the time, what you've done since then. And a lot of times those different hiring committees, search committees, award committees are going to look of different people. So that's not to say, especially if you apply to a large company, that that same person is even looking at your resume. So I wouldn't be concerned about updating. I would be more concerned if you are using the same document and you haven't updated or you haven't done that tailoring process.
Makes sense.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
great question.
Thank you.
And I loved your point about, yeah, can we pull some of these dates and locations out over here to the right a little bit more, spread out the content, use of that space more effectively. So that's a great point. And in the chat, a really good question too. Would you recommend adding a skills section to a resume or embedding it into the bullet points? So my answer may shock you. It depends. And so the reason why it depends is, are those skill sets listed as critical for what you're applying to, right? If you're applying to a specific grant and you have to be scuba certified in order to get the grant, yeah, that should probably be in a skill section almost at the top of your resume, right? If it's a main criteria, you can't have this without this skill set, we want to see it listed directly out. Now, we also want to see it demonstrated in your bullet points as well, right? Show them how you use that core skill set too. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to list every single skill set or have a bullet point for every single technical skill, but that's where your use of judgment comes in of, is this critical, right? Is this really important to give it the space on your resume? Great question. Ooh, I love the other questions we just put in as well. How should a remote experience look like? Should we mention remote, the location, or should the location of the company be, or where the company is, or where you are located? So this is, you know, something that we're seeing increasingly, right? We've all figured out the remote working world. So some of this comes to personal preference. We haven't heard from any employers specifically of leaning one way or the other. So you could put something like, for example, if in this experience, this first position was a remote position, sometimes people would put the location where they are, and then this is going to look very poor, but in parentheses, they may put the word remote, right? Or they may put the location of the company and then put remote. So that's kind of personal preference about how you want to list it. So if you want to share where you are working or you want to share the company's location, I think it also kind of depends on how you format it. So I've seen people where they'll put like the organization dash and then directly list that location. In that case, I would probably put the company location because you're directly associating it with that employer. Does that make sense? But again, that's always something that you know, you can look at, but it's also would be fine to just kind of remove this piece and not have that and just put remote as well. Great questions. Oh, another good question. So somebody put, what about hobbies on a resume? For instance, my child was in FSU Circus, very team building oriented. So little fun fact, I actually did my undergraduate here at FSU and I was also in the FSU Circus. So one thing I do is that's still to this day on my resume because it's a conversation starter, right? I go in to talk to people and they're like, excuse me, on your resume, you said you were in a circus? Can you elaborate? Right? And yeah, there's a lot of different things that you might do that are building unique skill sets, or more transferable skill sets, right? If you really want to show that you can collaborate with a team. So, think about it, if it's like hey, I run marathons on the weekend, that's a little bit different from like a club involvement that you've done. But again, does it relate back to what your audience needs to know about you? There are going to be some awards where they want to see that personal connection, right? They might say, share with us your research interest and hobbies, in which case, yeah, you could definitely list those on your resume. Now, if they don't list that, you might say, hey, is them knowing that I'm really into scrapbooking going to tell them anything about why I'm a good student leader? So some of it becomes a judgment call, but it's just kind of checking in to say, why do I want to share this experience? Is this something I would bring up in an interview, or is this something that's going to add value? Love it. Okay. So question in the chat, how to see the competition with age, but with experience and updated education versus young grad, continued education, how the employer looks at the resume. So I'm not really sure if the question is more about how you're being evaluated. Again, they're going to go off of what is the criteria we have and how are you marketing that you have that criteria. So if they're looking for, somebody specifically who's working on a dissertation related to this topic, it doesn't matter, where you are in that degree progression or some of those different things. They're going to be looking at, are you meeting the need of what we're looking for? So that's what I would focus on, is less about how you're being compared to others and really about how are you presenting yourself best. And then another question, is it a good idea to list group experiences? Like if you, group experiences, like if you were a TA for the same course multiple times, you almost did the same task? That is a great question. So what I come down to is, as long as it makes sense. And I know that doesn't sound very straightforward, right? But you don't want the person reading your resume to have to make assumptions. So if they're looking at it and you have, say you list Omni Gamer, and then you just put like maybe here 5, and I'm sorry, writing with the mouse is challenging. Maybe you put 5 semesters, right? And you just want to show you were a TA for 5 semesters, and then maybe in a bullet point you say, led courses on blah, 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 and list the different courses, right? As long as you give the reader, who again knows nothing about you and only has this context to go off, enough information that they're able to see what you mean by that grouping, right? The other thing that you can do is say you have a lot of positions at the same employer, or even a lot of degrees from the same university. You can kind of list that organization once and then have the different positions all listed underneath it, still having those bullet points. Does that kind of visually make sense? So really you're kind of bringing those dates down and focusing less on the date being with the company and more of it being associated with the specific position you had for that company. Yeah, great questions. Oh, yes. So this is a really great question. So it's, if you were promoted or changed positions at the same company, should these be listed separately? So thinking about, especially if you are a doctoral degree student, you're going to have a lot of time here at FSU. You're probably going to see some changes in the leadership roles. So, on your running resume, I would list every position separately and give every position the different bullet points that really describe those experiences. And then ask yourself, as you're building those tailored resumes, what is the best way to communicate that? Or what are the positions that you want to lead with? because it may be that you really want to highlight those two positions separately, or maybe in terms of spacing and what you need, you kind of want to merge them a little bit together. But that's a skill set to show like, hey, I was promoted. That means I've been doing good work, right? They're giving me more responsibilities. So a lot of good skill sets to highlight. All right, great questions. I'm going to keep moving a little bit, and we'll have some time for other questions as well. But I do want to get into some other sections that you might see on a resume. And I always like to highlight publications and presentations because I always get asked of like, aren't these more for a CV? Why would I list these on a resume, right? So this, when listing these on a resume, this probably is not going to be the full list of your publications or presentations, but rather something kind of like the bottom one where you say highlighted presentations, because you're really just wanting to call attention to maybe a specific topic or a specific conference that you attended. For example, that award we talked about at the beginning, the Graduate Student Leader Award, part of that was being involved in national, state, and international areas, right? So if I presented at a national conference, I might want to highlight that as part of that award search. So it's starting to think about, again, how much space do you have and what is an important part of your story to tell? And again, it may not be listing everything, but some of these more highlighted areas. One thing that I'll always say with both publication presentations, I was a history major in undergrad. We use Chicago. Most people have never seen Chicago. So you want to think about using your field's citation method. And then when you're applying in more general spaces, just making sure that it's clear and readable to your audience. The other thing that we sometimes recommend, especially if it is a group presentation or publication, bolding your name helps for it to stand out and really jump out to the reader. Whereas you can see here, you know, with it just being one, maybe not necessarily, but if I had two, like if these were both in the same section and I bolded my name in this one, for consistency, I'd want to go back and bold this one as well. Questions here? I feel like you all do a lot of citations. You're probably pretty familiar with these. So again, and you can always feel free to put highlighted or spotlighted presentations and publications if you're like, I don't want to communicate this as everything that I've ever done, but just really ones that I wanted to highlight. All right. Another section we are starting to see a lot more of are licenses, certifications, right? So some of you may be getting graduate certificates in project management or some of the other areas. So sometimes these will fall under education. Other times, different individuals like to highlight them. So one thing we want to make sure of is that you are clear, right, of what is the certification or award or license, who gives that credential, when did you complete it, and if you have a specific number associated with it, you can include it. Or if it's something that might expire, you can do like when you got it to present if it's still active. So in these two examples with that first one, teaching English as a foreign language, they show they did 150 hours and it was May 2016, right? I don't know where they did that. I don't know that this was an accredited program that they, you know, completed. All I know is the context that they've given me, right? As opposed to kind of in that next section, somebody completed the advanced cardiac life support training through the American Heart Association. Well, for that one, that's great that you did it. When did you do it? Is it still up to date? Those expire. So I wanted to show you here that this can be helpful information, but you want to think about what context is needed, right? And thinking about if these are certifications, again, that your audience is going to want to know about. Are these requirements for what you're applying for? Are these things that are going to help tell your story more authentically? Kind of just asking yourself some of those questions. But I have been seeing this popping up more and more, so I wanted to make sure I highlighted it. So any thoughts here? Okay. So this kind of relates back to one of the questions that came up into the chat. is should I include my interests, right? One thing I'm always going to go back to is please, please, please make sure that you read and follow directions. So if they say, please include your hobbies and interests on your resume, then make sure you include them, right? But typically we see these pop up a little bit more sometimes on CVs, especially if they're related to research interests, teaching interests. But there may be an argument that they're pertinent to an award you're applying to. Sometimes if you're applying to a specific position where there's some flexibility, they want to see where your main interest areas are. So this is kind of an example here. So does anybody have any issues with this example or anything that they don't like? And then I'll come back to the question in the chat. Anything stand out in a negative way? Like it, very jargony, wordy. Could just be an ongoing list. How do we feel about the use of color? What do you all think about research and teaching interests being in red? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Do we not care? Do we notice it? We like that in the chat. I heard it was forbidden to use colors. The resume, police are gonna strike down your resume. Only if required. Yeah, so color is a point of contention. So it's not forbidden, right? There are some fields where, your resume is a product of your work, right? What I go to is think about your purpose for using color. If you're like, hey, I just want to call their attention, they're probably going to want to see your content more than they're going to want to see this red title, right? The other thing that I think about is, we don't all perceive color the same way, and there may be visual impairment. So you don't want to make parts of your resume less readable because you didn't think about that. So I've heard from a lot of people that color contrasting is a big issue. And so if you are somebody who is very passionate and you're like, color is my life and I cannot submit a black and white resume, let's have a conversation. I'd love to know your passion behind that. But at a minimum result, you want to make sure that you print your resume in black and white to test it, to make sure that that color contrast is still strong enough. Because I also guarantee you, if they're printing out your resumes to review, when I print out resumes, I am not going to use my colored ink on your resume. So I am only going to print it out in black and white. So you just want to make sure that you're able to read it. The other thing that I would call attention to from this example would be the use of columns. So sometimes people are like, oh, I'm using space effectively. That's what Megan said. I'm being strategic. Look at me go. And unfortunately, the one downside with columns and tables is that a lot of that AI technology has a difficult time reading those. So it may only process what's in the first column, or it may not process any of it. So I see this a lot with skill sections as people want to put those in different categories. So what I recommend instead is just listing, maybe you want to list all your social media platforms that you're proficient with using. You can list social media and then a colon, and then truly list the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You're still using space effectively because it's not going to take up multiple lines, but you're not resorting to tables or columns either. Go back and check my chat. Another good question about hyperlinking. So that is kind of your choice. Some, kind of just depends on the person. I'm generally somebody where I'm going to print everything out and review it that way. I'm less likely to review it on my computer. I spend a lot of time already staring at my computer screen. Other people are the opposite. They don't want to print things out. So that might make the ease of hyperlinks easier. What you want to make sure again is that it doesn't impair the readability, right? So just make sure if it changes it to like a very light blue color when you hyperlink it, that you go into your settings and you can switch that back to black or another deeply saturated color to make sure that it's still readable. All great questions. All right. So do want to mention that those are not the only categories that you can have on a resume, right? We mentioned a project section earlier, skills sections. There may also be involvement that you list. So what are some of the other sections that you currently have on your CV or resume that you kind of want to share with the group for other people to consider? I know one thing I'll share from mine is I list professional associations that I'm actively a member of. And that was a question now that I'm remembering back in the chat, is if a credential is expired or maybe you used to be part of a professional association, should you still list it? And I would go back to, is it relevant, right? So if they require that you be CPR certified and your CPR certification expired, well, an expired certification for them isn't going to cut it, right? But if it's just having that background knowledge is helpful, then yeah. So did want to answer that real quickly. So memberships. Ooh, somebody put references. We'll come back to that. Any other sections looking at your documents? Professional development, great. Honors and awards. So there's really a long running list of things you can include, right? And so a lot of times it's just asking yourself again, what does my audience need to know and what do I want to be able to share with them? So I do want to talk about references. Thank you for putting that in the chat. So references is something we commonly see on the end of a CV. And even that I would challenge a little bit. And the reason why I would recommend removing that is because if you're applying to something and they want references, they're going to ask, right? And the nice thing about that is one that gives you time to follow up with your references to make sure, they may have given you a blanket statement of like, feel free to use me as a reference anytime, right? Well, they might get a phone call about this specific award and have no idea that you have applied for it or what kind of skills or experiences you want them to highlight. So for somebody to be the best reference to you, they really need to be in the loop with what you're applying to and why you think that you're qualified for that as well. So I would recommend pulling them off. You can build a separate reference page for yourself just on a separate sheet of paper. I've included an example here. This would be all of the relationship, all of the information you would want to keep for that. And then you can decide, as you're applying, do they just need you to supply this reference sheet, or is this information that you're probably more likely entering manually into a step of the application? But thinking about their name, any credentials they may have, title, who they work for, where that is, what their relationship to you was, and then some contact information. So reference is helpful, but do not need to take up space on the resume. Right, points. All right, I have a few more slides to get through. So some general don'ts for here in the United States on a resume. You do not need to include personal information like your marital status, birth date. Do not include headshots or images of yourself on resumes. That is one thing that the AI technology a lot of time will throw your application out. And you don't want to introduce any bias as part of that process as well. So no need for headshots or photos. You don't have to give any reasons for leaving past positions. You don't need to list any kind of salary requirements. And you generally don't want to list negative or irrelevant information either. Common mistakes we sometimes see are people who try to make themselves look better on their resume. I'm sure you've all seen it on social media where somebody takes a very, simple task and turns it into this very wordy explanation that sounds amazing, right? Like changing a light bulb becomes, well, now you're an engineer working with light, and that's fine, right? If it's authentic to you and what you do, right? Don't try to pitch yourself to be something that you're not. An example of that is like GPA. You don't need to round it up to make it look better. We also want to make sure that resumes aren't disorganized, that they're not overwritten or too sparse, right? There's a nice happy medium if it's not too wordy, but it also has enough context that we can get an idea of who you are. Really try to catch those misspelling and typos. They're gonna happen, right? Just like with a lot of documents that you stare at over and over again, you start to not see things because you're just over it. That's where you can come to me, come to our career liaisons. We're happy to proofread those and give you an extra set of eyes. And then making sure that your bullet points are impactful, right? We don't just need a list of duties or skills that you have. We really want to see the demonstrations of those pieces. So my just general tips for getting by: be clear and consistent, proofread and have these reviewed. If you are submitting something in paper, right, and you're actually handing this off to someone, we do have resume paper here in the Career Center that you are welcome to come and use and print for free. So if you ever wanted to bring copies of your resume to an interview or anything like that, know that that's a resource. My biggest tip for grad students is you all are so busy and so amazing and doing great work. Make sure you update this document regularly. Do not forget something amazing that you've done just because you've got a lot going on. Make sure you're tailoring it, and of course, keep that kind of running document for yourself. So I did want to just finish with this slide. So I am the graduate career liaison, but you also have career liaisons in all of your respective colleges as well. So if you're ever applying to something that's very unique to your industry area, one example is a lot of our students who are in STEM backgrounds, those project sections and technical skill sections have a unique look to them. So you're always welcome to meet with your college liaison. You get a newsletter from them. They're a great resource. So that QR code on the slide will take you to our liaison page that has all of their drop-in hours and information. And they both offer in-person and virtual drop-in hours as well. So when we say we are here to review your resumes, we are happy to do so. But also, as you have questions about job searches, career exploration, shadowing opportunities, a lot of different things related to your career. So we have 5 minutes to spare. So I'll open it up to, as you've been looking at your documents or as we went through the presentation, what other questions do you have that we didn't get a chance to answer yet? And it's also okay if you're in information processing zone too. Any comments on using specific keywords for each project to help pass the ATS? Yeah. So one thing that I would do is I always start with the position description before I get to the resume and kind of start highlighting words that stand out. So my method is I kind of go through once and I highlight key action words. So those are going to be those action verbs that you might list in your bullet points. Then I go back through, and I'm a color person. In a different color, I will circle words that showed up more than once. And if a word happens 3 or more times, I'm starring it, and that needs to be one of my first bullet points, right? So if they've gone through the effort in their posting of listing the same skill set multiple times, that's clearly something that they're looking for. So it's a little bit of taking your time, of really being critical of saying, do I understand what the award criteria is, and then thinking about how that relates to your different experiences. What you don't want to do is just copy and paste direct phrases from the job posting, right? You want to think about how that really fits into your work and experiences. Great question. I'm going to drop my email in the chat as well. And then, yeah, I think someone has their hand raised. Sorry, my videos are really small. Navigate through. Is it Daljeet? Do you have another question?
Did I miss it? Like how to utilize the learning from class projects to resume to fill the gap?
Yeah, so let me pull up. I didn't have a specific example because those are going to look a little bit different. But one thing that I'm going to do is.
Maybe I can reach you out later. That's okay.
Yeah, well, I'm going to also share you real quick. Let me see. Stop my share and reshare here.
Okay.
And I'll show you all where the resume guide lives as well, so that way you can see some good examples. So this is the Career Center website that was dropped into the chat. So you can always come to About Us and our career liaisons to access those hours. But under here, under resources and career guides, this is where you're going to find a lot of information. But I really like our resume writing guide. So if you click here, it's going to walk through, again, a lot of those same sections that we covered today. The bullet points, we have some sample action words. Again, you want to pull a lot of those directly from the experiences. But then you can start to see some different styles of formatting here. So this is an example of a good skill section, right? Where they don't use columns, but they kind of use that list format to list some of those key skill sets that they want to highlight. You can see volunteer experience and involvement. And then here is an example specifically of maybe a more technical skill section. So these are the languages, the platforms, and then here's a project section, right? So project section isn't going to have your position title or company name, right? A lot of times it's the name of your project and where it was associated, right? And that's usually to link back to your education. So I've even sometimes seen people will put the course name, not the course code, because that doesn't mean anything to anybody outside of FSU, but something like Introduction to Robotics or whatever it may be. And then these bullet points, again, really focusing on what you did within those projects. And so again, these, and you don't have to look necessarily at these categories that say, you know, this doesn't mean that every graduate resume looks like this. This is more in terms of like showing you how to highlight multiple degrees and those different kind of things. But in terms of like, do you like your headings centered and underlined, or do you like them bold and all caps? A lot of those are going to be different stylistic preferences.
Thank you.
Yeah. So other guides that you can find here as well. You can just scroll through and see we have a wide range. All right, question is, a specific experience is relevant entirely to a project. Is it okay to mention the project in the experience section, explain using bullet points in the project section? So just to make sure I'm understanding, so maybe as a research assistant, you worked on a very specific project and you want to mention that under your research assistant role, but also have it in the project section. You know, just think about, again, you don't want to duplicate information, right? So I see that a lot when people list leadership positions. So they may have a whole leadership experience category and they go on and on about this leadership role, and then their involvement, they list it again. So you may run into that. So we are at our time, but I'll drop my email in the chat one more time. So if other questions come up, again, I have appointments available in Knoll Network, which is going to be, if you just come to the Career Center site right here on our homepage, I'm also going to copy that link into the chat for you. So you're welcome to look at my open appointments or just shoot me an email as well. And with that, I'll turn it back to Keith.
Yes, thank you very much, Megan. That was wonderful. I have just launched a poll that we use to collect feedback. I will also send everybody a follow-up email, probably actually tomorrow because it's a busy afternoon coming up. That will include the slides from today, as well as a link to a Qualtrics survey where you can give us some written feedback. We'd love it if you can give us ideas of additional workshops, things you'd like to see covered in future workshops. We actually do read that and respond to it and plan things based on it. So please give us feedback. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.